I would like to give the floor to Rachel Powell. Rachel is the women's sector lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and she's also the chair of the Women's Policy Group in Northern Ireland. I'm very grateful to Rachel to accept this invitation. We just had an exchange on Twitter last week. I was not aware that Northern Ireland had developed a feminist recovery plan that was so excellent when I read it. And I'm so grateful to her for being here and talk to us about the process of them adopting this recovery plan. Thank you so much, Rachel.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me. And don't worry, quite often Northern Ireland, what happens, people don't know about it outside of Northern Ireland. We constantly are talking to Westminster being like, hello, we exist. So it's a policy issue. Don't blame me for not knowing. But as Serena said, my name is Rachel Powell and I'm the women's sector lobbyist for Northern Ireland. And I work for the Women's Resource and Development Agency. This is a feminist organisation that has existed since 1983 and was established during the conflict in Northern Ireland as a way of supporting women. So I now am the chair of the Women's Policy Group, which was previously an ad hoc group of different women working in policy roles. And really it's just become a lot more formal and well established in recent years. So I'm just going to start off by giving you a bit of context about, how we did this plan and who was involved before going into the plan itself and what we're doing next. So the Women's Policy Group is a platform for women working in policy and advocacy roles across different organisations, not just women's organisations. But we use this platform to share our work and speak with a collective voice on key issues impacting women in Northern Ireland. So we have a wide range of women's organisations, feminist organisations, but also trade unions, grassroots women's organisations, LGBT groups, migrant groups, service support providers, NGOs, human rights equality organisations, and much more. Basically, it's just a broad group of women who work in different areas with different parts of expertise, and we come together to share this expertise. It's a model that doesn't exist in a lot of places, and I think one of the reasons why we've been able to work so closely is because Northern Ireland is a small place with very unique issues, and it made sense for us to come together and share our expertise. So within Northern Ireland, I'm sure most of you will know we are a post-conflict society with a very fragile peace process. And as a result of this, gender equality has never been a priority because the focus has always been on our unstable political institutions and the conflict. So in the last 24 hours alone, I don't know if any of you seen what's been happening, but our political institutions have pretty much collapsed again. There has been a huge arguments happening over who's the leader, and a leader has resigned after just 21 days. So we're at a very unstable point right now. There's also been a huge rise in violence in the last few months, and I think everyone is just genuinely very concerned about Northern Ireland at the moment. But the reason why I bring this up is because just before COVID hit, our political institutions, our government had collapsed for 3 years. We had no government making any decisions. So we were already in probably one of the worst positions we could have been. Our government got back again in January 2020, and of course, 2 months later, COVID hit. So out of this 5-year mandate, 3 of them were wasted. The last year has focused on COVID, and now we're collapsing again. So it's pretty much been 5 years without any proper policy making. So obviously that has severe ramifications for women. So pre-pandemic, we were already much further behind than any of our neighbouring jurisdictions when it comes to gender equality. So just for context, we have no government funded childcare provision and no government executive childcare strategy. We have no gender equality strategy. We do not have the ratification of the Istanbul Convention or any ILO recommendations. We have the total refusal to abide by CEDAW recommendations and active policy that contradicts this going through the Assembly right now by the First Minister. We have no implementation of the UN Security Council resolution on women, peace and security. We have no violence against women and girls strategy. We don't have an anti-poverty strategy, LGBT strategy, anti-racism and more. We also have no access to abortion. Despite it being decriminalized in October 2019, COVID has been used as a reason to completely block the implementation of services. So women are still traveling during a pandemic to access healthcare that is supposed to be legal here. So I could go on all day about how far behind Northern Ireland is, but I don't want to. I want to talk more about the work that we've done. But I just wanted to highlight how the pre-existing inequalities and complete policy failures in Northern Ireland, how these existed before the pandemic and how much worse they've got now due to the pandemic, and why we decided then that a feminist recovery is needed, because our institution, our very state, is a failure right now, and we can't keep continue the way that it's going because women are suffering as a result of this. So within Northern Ireland, as I said, the women's sector is extremely well organised and close-knit. Women's organisations in Northern Ireland work together during the conflict to advance women's rights long before any ceasefires or peace processes or anything. And this is something that has very much strengthened our work to this very day. So within the Women's Policy Group, one of our members is actually from Hawaii, and she was telling us about this plan that was happening in her home state. And, you know, I think we should do something similar for Northern Ireland. So the moment it was launched, we decided, yes, this is exactly what we need. The policy failures here have so many similarities in terms of a history of colonisation, but also in relation to ongoing conflict and how that impedes policy making. So we were very much inspired by the Economic Recovery Plan by the Hawaii State Commission for the Status of Women, and decided to make our own version. And within Northern Ireland, there were similarities as well in the sense that we have multi-level governance. So yes, we are a devolved institution, but we're also a part of the UK. Ireland is also a stakeholder in our decision making, and we have a peace process internationally signed and backed up by the EU. So there were many different things that we had to try and work out how this should, how things need to be improved, who's actually going to change this. So last July, in July 2020, we decided to launch our Feminist Recovery Plan. And for those of you who have read it, you know, it's an extremely comprehensive plan. It's 127 pages long, which I think is just evidence of how many failures there are in Northern Ireland and what needs to change. But this was a huge collaborative project. We had over 30 organizations involved in writing this, which is really just a strength for the sector. But we decided that we wanted to give an evidence-driven plan. Here is the evidence of how you're impacting women negatively. Here are the policy recommendations we have on how it could change. And here's examples of how it's being done better elsewhere. So based on the evidence, both in Northern Ireland and globally, we felt that recommendations for a gender responsive recovery were needed urgently. And we wanted the voices of women who are being impacted to be leading this. So the plan itself, basically it was a roadmap for the NI executive. We handed them a roadmap on how to recover from the pandemic and said, you know, everyone's lives will improve if you do it this way. And we had 6 main pillars. So we had an economic justice pillar. And within this, we explored how we need to totally reassess our economic modelling, because the models that exist right now are based on the free labour of women, the unpaid domestic labour of women, and it can't continue. We also then developed a health pillar, a social justice pillar, a cultural pillar, a Brexit and a Bill of Rights pillar, and then an international best practice pillar. So within Northern Ireland, political representatives and decision makers tend to take a gender neutral approach to all policy making. And that is an aftermath of the conflict. It's due to the protected characteristics we have in place for anti-discrimination. So it's supposed to be that every single policy that's passed has an equal impact on all people from protected characteristics. But in reality, what happens is they will pass a form of legislation and say, well, that applies to men and women, therefore everyone's impacted equally, when that's not the case. So for example, with social security benefits, women overwhelmingly rely on these. When they stripped all of them after the financial crash, they said, yes, but if a man or a woman applies to this, they're both impacted. And actually ignored the fact that 86% of tax revenue savings from austerity came from women. So that's just an example of the harm of gender neutrality and why we have been challenging this. So we have been consistently raising our concerns, you know, from the moment the pandemic hit. We were putting out briefings, articles, letters to each level of governance that we have. And we were just finding that not only were there no actions being taken, but there wasn't even an acknowledgement of the fact that women were being disproportionately impacted. So we did have some successes in the beginning. For example, there were issues with women when they were being furloughed. They were no longer entitled to their statutory maternity pay. because they were only receiving 80% of their wages, and they fell below the pay threshold to receive full maternity pay. And once we raised that, that changed straight away. But that was basically it. That was the only acknowledgement that they had that women were being impacted. So we just got very frustrated at that point and thought, this isn't good enough. We need to do a full plan. So the plan itself focuses primarily on the importance of the care sector and unpaid care and women's labour and how it's undervalued. And what the pandemic put a sharp focus on was the value and importance of care work, both paid and unpaid, but also highlighted the essential nature of precarious and almost always low paid work that women do in Northern Ireland. So basically then we were showing how in Northern Ireland, women account for 79% of health and social care workers. They account for 82% of part-time workers, 70% of workers ineligible for statutory sick pay, 70% of all carers, and 91% of single parents. And these were the groups being the hardest hit. So we just had to say, this is having a gendered impact. It needs a gendered response. But despite the vast evidence of the pandemic being the brunt of the pandemic being borne on women's backs, the transition in and out of lockdown still just had no acknowledgement of this. We basically had an economic recovery plan come from our executive that didn't even mention women. We had roadmaps out of recovery that didn't mention childcare needs, and a complete refusal to acknowledge that there was a gendered impact of this. So within the plan, there's so much evidence that I'm not going to go into now, but lots of different evidence about how if we don't reassess our economic model in Northern Ireland, and if we don't take advantage of the fact that we are a devolved institution and have the flexibility to implement our own legislation, women will suffer for decades. And we were particularly concerned about this because we were in a period, 10 years after the financial crash, where the vast majority of austerity policies being implemented by the Conservative government were drastically impacting women in Northern Ireland. Yet we have no control over these policies. We have very little representation in Westminster. So we wanted a local stance to be taken where our own politicians were able to take flexibility while also lobbying Westminster at the same time. But some of the key recommendations we made were in relation to, for example, putting care at the core of our economy. So not just reassessing our economic modelling, but looking at other issues like the climate crisis. Northern Ireland's the only part of the UK or Ireland without a Climate Change Act. We need to develop one that is feminist and green and recognises care as a green sector, but also recognises the need for gender equality and the connection with that and extractivism to be seen and implemented into any strategy moving forward. And it's just frustrating that many of these recommendations we were making, we were being told, but men are being impacted badly too. And we had to say, yes, we get that. Our recommendations benefit men as well. 40% of all workers in Northern Ireland have dependent children. Why, when we think of children, do we only think of women? That's the issue. We also know that the unpaid labour of carers, a quarter of all carers are already in the workforce, and it accounts for over £7 billion worth of GDP in Northern Ireland. That's more money than our government has. So something needs to be done structurally, or we're going to have a major workforce crisis in the future. So just then, on the back of all of this, we've spent the last year lobbying non-stop with the Feminist Recovery Plan. And to do this, we basically were able to get the plan itself put onto the agenda of every single all-party group within the Northern Ireland Assembly. We were then able to get the Northern Ireland Civil Service and every department official to respond to the Feminist Recovery Plan recommendations. And then a number of us were appointed to a gender equality strategy expert advisory panel. And we were then able to write all of the recommendations for the government on what the gender equality strategy needs to be. And that was modelled on the Feminist Recovery Plan. So that all seems well and good, like we had some great successes. Then comes the last month, where Brexit and the political conflict in Northern Ireland is unravelling again. Now our executive only has 1 year left until the next Assembly election. So they've now accepted that they're in pre-election term, and there's a complete refusal to implement any recommendations relating to domestic violence, stalking, sexual violence, childcare, and Irish Language Act, all of these issues that were promised in 2020. There's also a complete refusal to acknowledge the gendered impact of the pandemic. So we decided then, we need to relaunch this evidence. We need to rewrite the Feminist Recovery Plan. And that's exactly what we are doing at present. We're relaunching it now on the 28th of July. We are going to have Cara from CSW coming to speak about how they were much more successful in Hawaii in implementing the recommendations of their plan. We also have the Vice Chair of the CDAW Committee coming to speak because of the great concerns that the CDAW Committee has around the extent of gender neutrality in Northern Ireland and the complete refusal to acknowledge women's international and human rights. We then will have some political representatives speaking at the relaunch. But most importantly, we have women from Northern Ireland who've told us their stories. Hundreds of women have written to us with their stories about, you have this in your plan, well, this is how I've been impacted. So our new plan is putting the voices of women completely at the core. They're ignoring the economic evidence. They're ignoring all of the data that we've given them. We want them now to look at the women that are impacted and say, well, we're going to continue ignoring you because we've just had enough. So the work has been huge. It's been ongoing. It's something now that's being acknowledged by UN Women as a model for feminist economic recoveries. The women's sector is also being acknowledged by the UN Security Council on successful political participation, but how the political response is inadequate. And yeah, we think we've had some amazing progress and work out of this, but unfortunately, we just have a totally non-functioning government. So we're now trying to figure out what to do next because we're just genuinely very worried about the future of women and gender equality in Northern Ireland. So not to end on a very somber note, but unfortunately that's the reality. When you're from a place where conflict is so deeply embedded in the society, gender equality gets deprioritized. So our mission is to ensure that that doesn't continue happening. So that's me. Thank you, Serena.